Today's discussion is on David Hume's dissertation on the passions. So first I'm going to go over the basics as he describes it at the beginning. This is his definition of good and evil. Things that bring an agreeable sensation are called good. Things that bring a disagreeable sensation are called evil. All motivation finds its source in passions rather than reasons. And this is an axiom throughout Hume, and you'll see that throughout this discussion. So a couple things to notice about that basic definition, that it's not a theological definition of good and evil. So if you read Paradise Lost, good and evil would mean something very different. But also, interestingly, it's the same language that Defoe uses in Robinson Crusoe. If you remember that Robinson makes a chart of good and evil, and evil is not wicked. It's not wicked things. It's things that are unhappy, unappealing, unpleasing about what's going on in his life. So, um, so for Hume, this is part of a larger philosophical system that he develops, which is that all knowledge is only available through the senses, and that sensory experience is the foundation for all of the passions. And what happens is that you have a sensory experience and it's either agreeable or it's disagreeable. And he's just laying out the axioms here that he's going to call those that are agreeable, those are good, those that are disagreeable are bad. And you'll see this is the building blocks for emotions, passions. So here's how the passions sort out for Hume. There are negative ones and positive ones, just roughly, I'll divide them that way. So on the positive side, for things that are associated either from, inspired by, or associated with agreeable sensations, joy, the good is probable or it's present. Like if you eat a cookie, you'd have some joy because it's actually happening and you're having an agreeable sensation of actually eating the cookie. Hope, good is uncertain. So you would like a cookie, you're hoping you get one. It's still a positive sensation, but you're thinking ahead of the sensation of eating the cookie and what you feel your emotional experience is hope. So desire, you're thinking, yeah, would I like a cookie? Yeah, absolutely. And so that's a desire, and that's when you're considering the good. And for desire, the good takes place in your imagination, and that you actually want the thing, but you're not actually having the sensation. Um, so there are other emotions or passions that are not directly inspired by sensations, but kind of are another layer of complexity. And so love inspires benevolence for its object, which isn't related to a sensation directly. And then, so love is one of those emotions that causes something else to happen. And love and hate are like that. So they're parallel, you can see on the chart. Love causes benevolence for its object. That means that if you love someone, you want only good things to happen to that person or that animal, and that because you love them. Pride, however, does not excite an action. By excite an action, he means pride doesn't really lead you to do anything, although you enjoy it. Positive affect associated with pride. Okay, so on the negative side, grief or sorrow means that the evil is actually here. The evil thing is, you're ill, you're not feeling well, and so you're actually experiencing the grief, and you're having a negative sensation, an unpleasant sensation, and you're actually experiencing grief or you're experiencing sorrow. When the evil is coming, that's fear. And fear is when you know that there's something evil coming. You are driving up to your house and you see that it's on fire, and oh, well, that's not a good example because um, you're in a you're driving down the beltway and there's a truck in the wrong lane coming straight at you. So that's fear because something bad is about to happen and you know it's about to happen and it's certain. So then you experience the emotion of fear. Aversion. Um, so the next day you don't want to get on the beltway. Okay, so you survived that crash. And next day you don't want to get on the beltway because something bad might happen. So aversion is you have an aversion to it because the evil is possible. So again, like the positive sensations, on the negative side, there are things that are not directly inspired by sensations, but are related to it. And also, just as love inspires another emotion, which is benevolence, hate inspires the emotion of anger. So Hume argues that if you hate someone, you will that will eventually turn into anger to them. And humility does not incite an action. He Hume talks about humility quite a bit in this essay, and humility is the opposite of pride. And humility is when you perceive yourself to be low on the totem pole, which we'll talk about more as we proceed through these slides as you work through Hume. So the way the human mind works is that it's not like a wind instrument where you play the sound and the note is hit and that's it. But it's more like a string instrument where um, you pluck the string and it reverberates and it keeps reverberating. So that's how the human mind works. And in other works, he talks a lot about the human mind working by way of association. So our mind never stays still, but it is always bringing about associations. So I look at that picture, I see some, you know, lovely musicians, and I think about, my experience in my childhood of playing an instrument. And then I think about my music teacher, and then I wonder, how is he doing? So you see, that's for Hume how your mind works. So objects with both good and evil affect will reverberate. So I'll the experience of the truck coming at me on the beltway, I will return to that. That's not just like a feeling and it's over. It will continue. Um, and I will also remember eating the cookie, although, that might make me want to eat another one, but it's something that is not simply over when it's done, is that I continue to get the sensation of either pleasure or fear or pain or whatever it is after the original stimulation is over. So for Hume, emotions are related to morality, and like a lot of 18th century writers who are philosophers of the emotions, he turns to the theater as an example. And he says that when you see a character who is virtuous on stage, that creates pleasure. And when you see a character who is vicious on stage, that creates uneasiness. And so um, you see Florinda in the Rover. This is a picture from the Rover, and it makes you happy because she's virtuous. And you see Don Don Pedro at the beginning, kind of being restrictive to his sister, and he's not exactly vicious, but you don't really like him because he seems to be insufficiently sympathetic. Although he gets better by the end of the play. Really, Don Antonio would be the better example. That he's somebody when you see him kind of fighting for Angelica Bianca, and he's supposed to be engaged to Florinda, then you have negative feelings about him. So that's how morality intertwined with emotion for Hume. And it's also emotion also leads to vanity. And you see, he talks a lot about vanity in this one. He says, nothing flatters our vanity more than the talent of pleasing by our wit, humor, or any other accomplishment. So we really enjoy it when we make somebody else laugh, or when if you wrote a play like The Rover, that would make you really happy. Um, but he goes on to say that it is taste alone that determines this. And taste is the sensation of pleasure around true wit. And a lot of 18th century philosophers talk a lot about taste as a philosophical problem. Why do you like one thing and not the other? Why do you consider one play great and another play insufficient? And that has to do with taste, which is something that Hume actually has a lot to say about in other writing, and so it seeps into this one. Um, so the power of exciting pleasure or uneasiness is the very essence of wit, of false wit or true wit. So presumably, false wit, like a dad joke, really bad joke, maybe gives you some uneasiness. False wit, when somebody's trying to be witty and they don't quite, hit the mark, that you get the experience of uneasiness. But when they do, you get the experience of pleasure. So beauty's essence is producing pleasure in others, and he has a lot to say about beauty. Beauty inspires love, um, and I won't go into detail about that. But notice that all of these values are social. So he's not talking about values internal to you, but they all have to do with your relationship to other people, which is very distinctive in Hume. And it's, actually distinctive in the Scottish Enlightenment in general was very interested in sociability, but perhaps Hume in particular. So he has a lot of discussion about pride and humility. And I'd mentioned that in the beginning as one of these foundational concepts to this particular treatise. So pride and humility are central to social emotions and basically how we negotiate other people in our world. So you know, sounds obvious, but good, we saw what good was. Good causes pride, evil causes humility. Um, Vanity results from seeking pride where it is not justified. And so he talks about how people love to make up stories about themselves because it produces this pleasure of vanity, even if even if they're not true, you can tell a story. I caught a fish this big. No, it was this big. Adventure stories. Um, People make those stories up because it makes them proud of themselves. So this is a slight digression, but I think it's an interesting one. There's a wonderful book by Norbert Elias, and he argues that vanity becomes a particular object of ridicule at this time because courtly elegance rather than feats of war become more valued as kind of, so he has a sort of he he's arguing for the difference between the feudal society and early modern society, and as it gets refined in the 17th century, that what's valued about people is not that they're strong and brave and can kill other people, but that they're able to succeed socially. And we're definitely still in that moment for the most part. And so that's why Don Quixote was such a popular text and such a product of this time, because it's all about somebody who is not a great warrior, and that but he's still committed to warrior values, and that he suffers from vanity, or what Hobbes would say, vainglory. um, so so what is this vainglory and pride? Well, he says some people are vain of their country. Some are vain in disparaging their country and compared to others. So you can be proud of your country, but another form of vanity is, to say, um, well, look at how New Zealand did such an, and that's not a good example. You have to say, well, I was in Amsterdam last year, and I love the way everybody rides bicycles in Amsterdam, and they're so much better than Americans who always depend on cars. That may be true. I may have genuinely admired the Dutch in their transportation methods, but in expressing that, it's a form of vanity because it is reminding you that I have been to Amsterdam. And so that's so it's not a neutral comparison. So I think that was something that also people did a lot in the 18th century because travel brought status and prestige. Some people are also vain of their family and of their ancestors. And so, but at the same time, he says they're ashamed of such as are mean or poor among their friends and relations. So you can feel either pride or humility in relation to people that are your relatives. And because in this Hume explains that the reason for that is that these people reflect on you because they're contiguous to you, and that somehow that's a relationship of association that gives you pride or humility. Um, and so there's punishments in the 18th century, like the pillory, were focused on creating shame. And I'm not going to talk about slavery too much in this particular incident, but I think it's pretty clear that part of what's going on with slavery in the 18th century is this sense of being stigmatized by it. It's not just the obvious misery and physical torture, but there is a kind of way in which he actually talks about this in other places where it feeds the vanity of the master to have somebody enslaved to him, and then the slave is denigrated, and not just physically but emotionally as well. um so property is a big topic in Hume, not just here but elsewhere. So property has a great influence on the passions. And remember how I was telling you about in Hume's version of people, they are related, that the mind works by association. And so property has a great impact on your who you are because a piece of property is a direct form of association with you if you own the thing. So you can walk by a beautiful garden and say, wow, that's a beautiful garden. What beautiful flowers. I love this garden. You can stand there and observe the garden and get all those positive sensations and positive emotions that come with just simply the flood of beauty. But you don't experience pride, and you only experience pride if it's your garden, because if it because what property is for Hume is a kind of set of mental associations between you and the thing. And that's why a person wants the thing. It's because it reflects on you in some way and it creates your identity and who you are. And I think Hume was really the first to think about how being in a commercial society really transformed human identity, sense of identity. And so when during the consumer revolution, which is what this period is often referred to, there's a kind of analysis here about why people buy things they don't need, or why they buy, continue to keep buying things or keep trying to accumulate more and more property. And it has to do with Hume with the very sense of self. So the mind produces ideas through association, and it never holds still. You can't really focus on one thing. You're always wandering away from the one thing. In fact, maybe mentioned this before, but in yoga, they always try to get you to just not think about anything else, like try to clear your mind, think about one thing. And it's really hard to control your mind from just continuing on its normal string of associations. Um, so the strongest form of association is simply property. So the house causes the mind to associate with the owner. So if this actually isn't my house, but if it were my house, you would look at that house and you would think of me, and that would, exalt me because it's a really nice house. And that makes property itself kind of a form of kinship. It's like I'm related to the house, that there's some sort of some very personal relationship between me and the object. And Hume is very interested in the way we relate to objects, and his discussion of property really is really wonderful, I think, and interesting. So all of this kind of personal relationship to property is very important because, as in Hobbes, so in Hume, we also operate by way of social comparison. So comparison of ourself to others, according to Hume, is the greatest cause of malice, whereas compassion is an unease with the suffering of another. So compassion, as we've discussed many times, isn't the same thing as sympathy. Um, and he says it is in order to fix and confirm their favorable opinion of themselves, not from any original passion, that they seek the applause of others. And so the applause of others is a social emotion, and so we create basically our whole opinion of ourselves by what others how others respond to us. Is your whole identity is social, according to Hobbes. I mean, to Hume, to Hobbes also. But Hobbes isn't really interested in personal identity quite the way Hume is. So Hume is really going into this question of who we are as human beings. Few objects excite pride or self-satisfaction unless they are valued by others. So the reason why I want that house is because other people want the house. And you could just say abstractly, it's a beautiful house, but if you didn't want it, if there weren't some kind of a social value accumulated to it, it would not be desirable. And so there's a whole set of things that are pleasurable and good, but they don't bring about pride. And those are things that you can't have any kind of social comparison over. So, like the weather, you could have really nice weather and be really happy, but everybody else gets the same weather. So there's no pride there. But if you get a house and you're the only one with that house, you could be really proud. Now, if you built that house and other people built bigger houses around it, all of a sudden your pride would be completely gone. And the house is exactly the same, but you're different because the valuation of the house is based on this social comparison. So on the negative side, there's pride and then there's shame. Illness can be a source of shame, Hume discusses. It's a sign of mark of vulnerability. Poverty, meanness, disappointment produce contempt and dislike. So there's an aversion to people who are impoverished and suffering, and that kind of um, limits one's feelings about them. Um, when these misfortunes are great or presented in strong colors, they produce compassion, tenderness, and friendship. So when there's kind of like a moderate amount of suffering, you're kind of annoyed by people. But he does argue that abject suffering can produce this compassion, and the reason for that is that people who are really suffering in an abject way are very distant from you and you're not competing with them or comparing yourself to them. Whereas people who are kind of like you, but failing in some way or below you are people that, according to Hume, um, they sort of undermine your own status. So they may not get the same level of compassion because everybody wants to avoid being the object of contempt. And finally, pride. Wealth, of course, brings pride. Relatives bring pride. Uh, and that's because we associate these relatives with ourselves, because that kind of adds to our self conception. So things that we own and things that we're related to build our sense of self, according to Hume, which is constantly being constructed. There actually in Hume is he has a very radical sense of self, which is that there is really no consistent self. It kind of changes moment to moment, year to year, and but there it's all affected by these external factors, and uh, and so not only the people you're related to, but their accomplishments can actually bring you pride. And so finally, we can only envy people who are similar to us in social status, because again, like um, he discusses the enlisted man doesn't envy the general because there's such a wide gap between them. And so if you think about think about if you've ever experienced envy of another person, it's probably a person who's not that different from you. It's somebody who you're kind of competing with at a kind of level where there's some equality. And so you're not competing with, for your bank account with Jeff Bezos. And you're also not competing with a homeless person. You're competing with somebody who's more related to you, and that the association of these ideas works more strongly when you have proximity.